In this first video for the class, I want to give you a brief overview of the topics we're going to touch on and cover throughout the course, and then give you a very brief overview of history as regards to packaging, so you kind of understand how we got to where we are today. First, on the overview, these are some of the things we're going to be covering. History, which I'll go over in a second here, and then we'll talk about current looks in packaging design, branding, types and different types of materials, market research and demographics, retailing, design, which is really the focus of the class, working with imagery, color, and typography, the actual physical production and printing of different packaging options, digital mockups, and technology and legal considerations. So that's just kind of a brief overview. Touching on history, and so this is a very brief history of packaging, just to kind of give you some highlights throughout recorded history and how we got to where we are today. So if you go back throughout human history to the very beginning, humans have always needed ways to contain, carry, store materials. So going back to the earliest civilizations, you can see different forms of baskets and pottery that are made, even using seashells as a way of creating containers to hold various things. If we move on to ancient Egypt, they really started to fine-tune this idea of containers and packaging. So there you can see some containers made out of woven reeds for baskets, wooden casing. And then on the bottom left here, these are canopic jars, and these are very special containers. These contained the internal organs of the pharaoh after the pharaoh had passed away. To be specific, it would be the stomach, the intestines, the lungs, and the liver. It was thought these organs were very much needed in the afterlife, and they needed to be preserved. And so they got their own very specific containers. As we move into from the ancient Egyptians into the Greeks and other civilizations around the Mediterranean, you can see more containers are made. In particular, the containers on the left, these are called amphora, and it's a very kind of unique design. They basically come to a bullet point at the bottom, and you would think, well, that's not very practical. How do you stand it up or do anything with it? They're actually designed to fit within the beams in the hull of a ship. So as Mediterranean trade really took off between the countries around the Mediterranean Sea, this was a way to store them and keep them stable as they crossed the oceans there. And if you did want to, stand them up, the bullet point made it easier to kind of drive it into sand or dirt, and so it would still be able to work on land as well. And as I said, this is going to be a very brief lecture, so kind of giving you the highlights here. So we're jumping ahead to around 300 BCE, before the Common Era, to the Celts. And the Celts were the people who occupied what is modern-day Britain and Ireland. And they are the people credited with creating the first barrel or cask. So here you can see a more modern version of it. But the idea of creating these wooden barrels that were usually held together by metal rings, again, made it very easy to transport on ships across the ocean. And we focus a little bit on Western culture, but packaging is also very, very important in Asian cultures here. And here you can see, this is from Japan, about 100 BCE, before the Common Era. This is a woodblock print from Ukiyo-e, but look over there on the right, you can see a wrap package. So even back then, actually two of them. So being able to not just contain something, but wrap it up in a way that was pleasing was a trait that you see going back over 2,000 years. Really jumping ahead now and back to Western culture, I just want to talk about the invention of the printing press by Gutenberg. A similar earlier form of printing was actually created or discovered, as you will, in China. But in the West, Gutenberg is credited with creating the first mechanical printing press, which allowed for the rapid printing of multiple copies. And the reason this is important is if you look at modern packaging today, with all the labels and the packaging and the paper and the board that you use on it, being able to print things quickly and in quantity was going to be key. Jumping ahead even further to around 1700, glass production. The first glass bottles were produced actually in Asia, also going back to about 100 BCE or before the Common Era, and even in the Roman Empire. But it really took into the 1700s before creating glass bottles and jars took off as a way of containing and holding various materials. And then when you jump ahead even further to the 1880, where the first machinery to automatically or mechanically make bottles and not blow them by hand really caused glass as a packaging media to take off. Then we get to 1795 and Napoleon. Why is Napoleon in a packaging lecture? Well, the late 1700s, Napoleon and his armies were rampaging across Europe, and as you can probably imagine, the people they conquered weren't in a very good mood to feed Napoleon's army, and Napoleon needed a way to be able to feed his troops. And because the locals weren't going to help them out, often ship it from France so that they could, again, feed the troops. And he needed a way that was going to safely transport food and be able to keep over a period of time. So Napoleon sponsored a competition. He offered 12,000 francs for anyone who could come up with a method for preserving food in containers and be able to ship it. And this was the winner of the prize. So it was a method for heating, boiling, and sealing food into airtight glass jars, in this case sealed with wax. It's essentially the same process we use today. Obviously, our packaging looks primarily different than this, but this idea of pre-cooking food and preserving it in airtight containers is something that we owe to Napoleon. With the Industrial Revolution, too, you saw a lot of things that used to be, a lot of processes that used to have to be done by hand were now being mechanized. And some of the things that really applied to packaging design was lithography, which is a way of printing, but printing with color. Also, machines that would mechanically make paper. Up till now, paper would have to be made by hand, which was very costly and very labor-intensive. Things like the linotype machine, which allowed for you to set lines of type, hence the name, for printing, which previously would have to be set letter by letter, and now you could actually do it much more efficiently and cheaply. Here's an example of color lithography, so you can really see how this would apply to packaging design. Up till now, most printing had to be done in black and white, so obviously from a consumer standpoint, being able to add color to it would make it much more appealing. Again, all throughout the Industrial Revolution, commercial expansion occurred primarily because up until this point, you really had kind of the aristocracy, and then you had the lower classes. And the lower classes didn't really have the money or inclination to buy a lot of commercial products. But during this time, you saw the emergence of what we consider the middle class now. These were people didn't work in the fields. Maybe they had more shop or office type jobs. They had more income. They could afford to buy more products. And then you can really see where this is when packaging took off, because now people had to try and appeal to these people with money. And you can see the various styles take off with Victorian design, which we'll talk about, trying to appeal to people who had some money to spend. Here you can see some additional examples of that as well. The first, what we would call tin can, there you can see it on the left, doesn't look terribly appetizing. But again, we owe this to the French. And the basic idea of how tin cans work, where they're hermetically sealed, which keeps whatever food is inside fresh for months. Isn't the process has been modernized, but it's not appreciably much different than the first process back in 1810. Then we get to 1815. I threw this in here. This is a trademark. These are Smith Brothers cough drops, which you can still buy to this day. But I'll draw your attention to the words under the portraits of the two Smith brothers. On the left, you see trade, and on the right, you say mark. And why this is important, and you're going to see this crop up, is Smith Brothers cough drops were very popular and made a lot of money even back then, and a lot of people would try and do imitation of it. And the Smith Brothers wanted a way to protect their investment and their income, and so they trademarked their likeness, they trademarked their name. Anyone using their name or likeness, there would be could be taken to court or sued, or there'd be financial penalties. And so this is kind of the advent of modern American trademark. Now, trademark is just one of several marks you'll see in packaging design. Here's another one. This is the Circle R. You see this especially with logos. It's the registered trademark. So this means you have filed paperwork with the government that you own the trademark for this logo, this packaging, whatever it is, and you'll see it appear with that Circle R on there. And so here you can see an example. Here's the Vans logo. If you look under the toe of the skateboard there, you can see the little Circle R on that. So again, this is a way to legally protect yourself from people trying to rip off your name or your product. So that's the Circle R registered trademark. You'll also see this, the TM, which also stands for trademark. The only difference between this and the Circle R is you haven't filled out the paperwork with the government. You haven't registered it. Although if you put the TM trademark mark on there, you are afforded many of the same legal protections as you would with the Circle R. Circle R is always better, but again, the trademark TM mark will work as well. Now this works for products. If you're working with services, so here you can see on the SunTrust, which is a bank logo, you can see that little SM off to the side. That stands for service mark. So this is a trademark register or a trademark, but it's for if you offer services. So in this case, like banking. Then you get to copyright, the famous Circle C. And I put Disney up here because, excuse me, Disney is the 800-pound gorilla of copyright. So copyright, when you copyright something, it pertains to creative work. So if you're a book author or you're an artist or you're a playwright or you write music, copyright is a way to protect the creators. So, as I mentioned, I put Disney up here. So copyright originally was only for about 20 years, which meant after 20 years, anyone could go and use the artwork, make derivative artwork from it, build on it or whatnot. And over the years, that was expanded from 20 to 50 years. Then for a long time, it was the life of the artist plus 20 years. Technically, Walt Disney created Mickey Mouse in 1928, and the copyright was the life of the author or the creator plus 20 years. Well, Walt Disney died in 1966, which would have meant the copyright on Mickey Mouse would have run out in 1986. And what that meant was anyone could make their own Mickey Mouse merchandise or cartoons or anything. And what has happened, going back now for 50, 60 years, the main driver of copyright in the United States is the Walt Disney Company. And every time the copyright on Mickey Mouse has come close to expiring, the Disney Company has lobbied Congress, gotten extensions. So the interesting thing is going to be 2023 is when the current copyright on Mickey Mouse expires. So it'll be interesting to see what the Walt Disney Company has in store. No doubt they're going to push that out even further if they can. Back to the history, 1856, we get to corrugated cardboard, which you're probably familiar with, especially if you ever order anything from Amazon online. Cardboard box. This is thinner cardboard, and particularly the mechanically printed kind. So here you can see some early types of the cardboard box design. What I love on the left, this was a brand they created. Unita biscuit. What does the word Unita mean? It doesn't mean anything, but if you say it out loud, you need a biscuit. So even back then, the National Biscuit Company, which you may know as Nabisco, was coming up with branding for their various projects. As we get into the beginning of the last century, mass production in the 1900s, here you can see not just one of the original Quaker Oats cylindrical cartons that you see there, but there you can see the Quaker Oats factory where they would have train loads or train cars lined up being filled with Quaker Oats being taken to market there. And there you can see a schematic of one of their first mass production machines. 1912, we get the invention of cellophane. So if you've ever bought any candy, you're familiar with that. It's a clear plastic or a clear cellulose material that allows you to seal out air to keep food fresh, but also allows you to see through it so you can see what the food looks like. Supermarkets, as we know them, a couple stops on this history here. 1930 was the first what we would consider a supermarket, although you wouldn't recognize it from what we know today. But up until this time, a grocery store, you would walk in, there would be a counter, and then there would be big long aisles stacked with food and products behind the counter, and you would come in with your shopping list and you would hand it to a clerk, and the clerk would go and pull all the food. This, in 1930, the King Cullen Market was the first one where you actually got to wander the aisles on your own and pulling your own shopping list and not having to involve other people in it. Now, it still wouldn't look what we would consider a modern supermarket. We'll get to that in a minute here. 1933, polyethylene. This is what you guys would probably most recognize it if you see any of the clear plastic wrap that's used for breads and assorted foods product. The original lump of polyethylene, you can see there on the left, the first pound was used to make this pillbox. So it was very kind of thick and rigid, but over time it's been refined, so it's used into a lot of different plastic wrap. Technology advancing kept going into the 20th century. Tin foil, which was actually made of tin, had been around for a while, but it was replaced in the early 20th century with aluminum, what we would still use today. So modern aluminum foil isn't much different from the original aluminum foil. You will still hear people refer to aluminum foil as tin foil. That's just a carryover over time. Old habits die hard. 1922, Clarence Birdseye, yes, that was his name. He invented the modern frozen food process, which led to the TV dinners and microwave dinners that we have today. Here's some looks at different styles. Once you get into the 20th century, and again, still appealing to middle-class consumers, a lot of times the only difference between various products really came down to the branding on them. So we'll start looking at different looks. This is from the Art Deco 30s and 40s period, also covering the Depression and the Second World War. But you can see how the packaging and the upper right-hand corner still look pretty primitive, but by the time we get to the Lucky Strike packaging of the 40s, you can see there's much more emphasis placed on graphic design. Aerosol cans really have only been around for about 70 years. Here you can see some of the earliest ones. Then we get into mid-century modern graphic design of the 50s and 60s. So here you can see some examples of it. There you can see also an example of some of those frozen dinners that were popular in the years before the microwave, where you would actually place them in the oven and cook them. Obviously, having the aluminum foil would be helpful there. Mid-century modern design, here's some more examples. I honestly believe This is the start of the scary clown meme that goes around because I would think if you were a little kid, that clown would scare the hell out of you. But here in the upper left-hand corner, you see Grand Union Supermarket. This is the first supermarket that looks like the supermarkets we know today. This very first one was in New Jersey, and it really instituted lots of what we recognize in the supermarket today. So that store wouldn't look a lot different than modern day Ralph's or Albertsons. Aseptic cartons from 1961. This allowed you to actually package liquids but not have to use glass or cans. So this is a production technique where it's actually cardboard, but it's cardboard that's in a waterproof membrane around it. So this was the advent of milk cartons, juice cartons. Up till this point, if you had got milk, you'd have to get it in glass bottles. So this certainly is a lot cheaper, easier to produce option on it. Then we get into some of the packaging from the 60s. Put a couple things up here that you would recognize today. The advent of the Pringles can. Selling chips in a tube was considered kind of weird and revolutionary for the day. Also, you will see the classic McDonald's fry container, which was introduced at that time. Design in the 70s, I put this up here. The one on the right I thought was really kind of funny, and I remember this as a kid. Those were women's hose that you could buy in the grocery store. It was called Legs, and they were packaged in little plastic eggs. And so you can see the different colors up there. And the reason I remember that as a kid is everyone used to save those stupid plastic eggs, and then we would use them for Easter egg hunts. So don't know what year those finally went away, but it's been a while. 1978, the advent of the clamshell. So this is a polystyrene clamshell. For years and years and years, all fast food food came in these containers. They were cheap to produce. They held heat in well. The only problem with them is and we'll talk about this more with materials, they do not biodegrade. Once this goes into a landfill, it's going to be there for thousands of years. And so all throughout the late 70s, the 80s, into the 90s, a lot of food was packaged in these polystyrene clamshells. But once the damage once people realized the damage it did to the environment, they were slowly phased out. And we'll get to that in a minute. Here you can see more of those polystyrene containers as we get into the 80s. There you can see with the Walkman too, this was the advent of the blister pack. Those are those really hard plastic containers. Usually it's got a cardboard backing on them. They are nearly impossible to open, but they offer extreme protection, allows you to see the actual product in there. And so those were really introduced in the 1980s. 1990s, there you can see what replaced those polystyrene clamshells. And these are still in use today, the cardboard ones. Now, they don't contain the heat like the polystyrene does, but they also break down because they're cardboard. So after a few years, they will basically turn into dust. A few other things just from a packaging standpoint, the stupid parental advisory sticker that was placed on a lot of music in the 90s. To try and protect all of us from bad words. That's when that was introduced. I don't even know if they do it anymore with downloads. It kind of defeats the purpose. Packaging from the first 20 years of the 21st century. A couple things in here. And we're going to talk more about Apple when it comes to packaging as well. I also just mentioned, too, this was a really brilliant packaging solution for Target for their prescription drugs. And what was brilliant about it is because it flattened out the container, it allowed you to put the label on flat, which made it much easier to read, as opposed to having to kind of constantly twist your pill bottle to try and read what was on it. It was also great for seniors because the flat shape actually made it easier. You could grab the bottom and then twist the top very easily. So for seniors that had mobility issues, it was a great solution. Unfortunately, a few years ago, Target sold their pharmacy functions to CVS, and they promptly did away with this. So sometimes the best ideas suddenly go to an early grave for reasons beyond our control. And then here's some other more interesting modern. We're going to talk about current trends in another lecture. But what does the future hold? Here's some kind of prototypes for different packaging for the future. I particularly like the inflatable Nike packaging. I hope that actually comes to pass. You never know. We will see. Some other examples. This is a prototype for the Doritos container that basically opens up into a little container. Don't know if that has gone into production. I think it was going to. Some other, and one of the things, and we're going to talk about this as well, is the idea of sustainability, which I'll talk about here. And that's packaging that actually doesn't go into a landfill. It's packaging that you can also use for other products. And I've got two examples here. On the left is this kind of rigid foam packaging for a flat screen TV. And once you take the TV out of the packaging, you can stack that packaging up and create a stand for the TV that also has a couple little bookshelves in there, a couple shelves in it. On the right, here's a package that has a t-shirt in it. Once you open it and take the shirt out, you can actually fold and tear that packaging and create a hanger to hang the shirt on. So we'll talk more about sustainability in packaging, but coming up with really ingenious solutions is kind of the wave of the future in packaging design.